Good morning, everyone. I'll wait a few more um, seconds for everyone to fully join this morning. All right, it looks like we're mostly connected. I'll go ahead and start with our introductions this morning. Good morning. It is Monday, September 16th, and I am Nicole Kinsey, presiding hearing officer of the Administrative Hearings Office of the State Water Resources Control Board. This is the hearing on the pending petition for assignment of state filed application 25517 and accompanying water right application 25517X01. And the pending request for release from priority of state filed applications 25513, 25514, the unassigned portion of 25517, 22235, 23780, and 23781 in favor of water right application 25517X01 of Sites Project Authority. The hearing today is being conducted by Zoom teleconference. It is also being broadcast live on the AHO YouTube channel. And as usual, if you're not planning to speak and participate today, please do use the YouTube channel for viewing the hearing rather than logging into the Zoom platform. Both the audio and video of this hearing are being recorded, and we will post files of this recording in the FTP folder for this proceeding. The YouTube recording will also be available on the AHO YouTube webpage. If at any time you're experiencing technical difficulties today trying to communicate with us or to access the Zoom platform, please send an email to the site's email inbox at sites-wr-application@waterboards.ca.gov or to the AHO email inbox. AHO staff will be monitoring that inbox and can let me know. If for any reason I am having technical difficulties today and I'm not able to, or I'm dropped off the Zoom, a member of the AHO staff will call a brief recess while we sort that out. We will take breaks today as usual, as we have done, a mid-morning, a lunch, and so forth. Once again, we will have a hard stop at 5 p.m. as we regularly have. As in the past, Ms. Mullen is here with us virtually and will be handling the exhibits. So if you are a witness or an attorney, please feel free to address Ms. Mullen directly and ask her to bring up a particular slide or exhibit for you. My intent is to just carry over appearances as we have done. I will pause briefly. I don't see anyone new who has not had a chance to introduce themselves on the Zoom platform. I believe everyone is here. But if there is someone new who needs to introduce themselves, please go ahead and come off mute and let me know. All right. Where we left off, we'll address some housekeeping first, but where we left off, just so I think we're all on the same page, was with cross-examination of the authorities witness panel that was addressing, generally speaking, fisheries issues. And I believe we were in the middle of cross-exam by Mr. Busher, and that's where I intend to pick up once we're ready to get started today. First, a couple of procedural matters. I'll start first. I see, Ms. Moore, is this a good time? I see you're in a car, and if you're driving, we can wait until later. Would it be better if we waited until later? You look like you're moving. You're on mute, so I can't hear you.
I am driving, but I'm almost home, and you're on my radio. It's no big deal to me.
Why don't we circle back? I don't want to.
Okay.
Right.
All right.
Once you're stationary. Because I think we have a couple of other things to talk about. Let's see. I think I had previewed last week the thought that maybe we would have an additional in-person day, one or two additional, by in-person, I mean hybrid. It's always an option to appear on Zoom. And this is generally speaking at the request of the board members because they do have an interest. If more than two of them want to participate in the proceeding, we do have to have a physical space. That doesn't mean all of you have to be in the same physical space, but it means that I have to at least plan for a physical space for a quorum of the board to sit together because those are the rules. Um, since I last talked to you, we on our end are honing in probably on October 2nd with a follow-up on a follow-up, I mean a runner-up of October 8th. But I wanted to look to the room to see if there's any further input you would like to share as to whether your clients and your witnesses, that kind of thing, have an interest in person. It doesn't matter to you. You have a particular day you'd prefer, or you'd prefer we stay on the Zoom platform entirely. All of these things. If you have any input, I maybe I'll start with the authority and then I'll look to the room. Do you have a I know it wouldn't be the idea is it wouldn't be your case in chief anymore, but Mr. Hitchings, do you have any input on this?
Yeah, thank you. Good morning. Yeah, I think our case in chief would probably have concluded by then. So I think we defer to the Protestant group. If we're local in Sacramento, so if the Protestants would show up in person for any of their witness panels, we may come over. I think it just depends, but I think we defer to what the Protestants may decide to do since they'll likely be in the middle of their cases in chief.
Thank you. Great. With that, I'll look to Mr. Busher. You came off mute the fastest, so I'll look to you.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to this. We are amenable to hybrid days if that's what accommodates board member participation. We had reached out to a bunch of our witnesses to assess whether they would be available to testify in person, and it looked like September 30th was tentatively the best plan for that. That's likely, I think, to be near the beginning of the case in chief. I don't have confirmation from everybody yet, so obviously as the schedule moves forward, we can see if other days are available. I don't know if Mr. Mooney has anything to add there.
Thank you. Mr. Mooney?
No, I don't have anything to add.
Okay. Thank you. And then Mr. Reese, I'll look to you because you're on camera on behalf of the Delta interest. Do you have any particular thoughts or preferences? And you are on mute I can't tell if you're speaking or not.
Sorry, I was having trouble getting off of mute. No, we don't have, we'll accommodate whatever you need to do to have, if you need to have board members present. Not sure if we'll come or not in person, but whatever you need to do.
Great. Thank you. Are there others who would like to chime in? Mr. King.
So as I mentioned Friday, I have a conflict on the 8th. So that's just to the extent that I may be having, my allocated time. So just to the extent that I'm going to participate, the 8th is problematic for me, but I'm free under that age.
Okay, thank you. I will, I'm going to report back on this issue. I'll let you know as soon as possible. Of course, we have to, you will know at least 10 days in advance because we have to notice it 10 days in advance. And we'll try to pin this down. I expect we will have at least one additional hybrid day. But once again, it's entirely optional whether you choose to participate in person or not. My intent is to issue soon, probably in conjunction with this, an amended notice of hearing that would include a schedule for rebuttal. What I'm looking at right now is to have rebuttal exhibits due early December and hold our rebuttal in the middle of January. I think that lays out well. So that would be, we would have a chance to, in a little bit, massage that. What I'd like to do is issue the notice and then you'll have all of the dates in front of you. And then if there are serious problems and conflicts, we can talk about those. I realize that we may need additional case in chief days, depending on how this goes. It's always hard to predict, but would consider October 22nd to be fair game. We had held that as a possibility for a site visit, but I think we could pick it up as another case in chief day if we need it. I think ideally I don't know. We'll as we get closer, we can talk about what makes sense if we need days in addition. But given that the bulk of the case in chief portion of the proceeding will be done well in advance of early December, I think it makes sense for us to plan for rebuttal that way. Ms. Meserve. I see your hand is up, but you're on mute.
How about now?
I can hear you now.
Thank you. Good morning. Just wanted to mention that I also have a conflict on the 8th of October. So if we could do the in-person or the hybrid day on one of the other days, that would be better for me and anything that I would need to do with our witnesses. And then also, as I was preparing a fisheries cross exam, I just, in terms of the schedule, I would like to advocate for the ITP from the DFW if it is going to be. We would like to have that ITP in place. I'm not promoting issuance, but
Right.
in terms of preparing our rebuttal, I'm finding it a little challenging, the fact that we just have an application, and so we don't know what the conditions are for this project from DFW. So I'm a bit troubled by the possibility of preparing rebuttal testimony without that piece in place.
Understood that, and thank you for that, because I think I failed to caveat that this schedule, as was the case before, the schedule I think still depends in part on issuance of the ITP in mid-October, as was projected. I think is projected, but I don't know. CDFW is not here to tell us otherwise. So I would consider any schedule that I put out to be, and I would include language in the notice to be somewhat contingent on the ITP, although we could talk, if it doesn't come out mid-October, we could talk about how we want to deal with that. I'm going to turn to Ms. Mandel-Rice and then Mr. Hitchings, I see you.
Slightly off-topic comment, but it does relate to the schedule. It's kind of in response to, I think, Mr. Hitchings' comment that he expects their case in chief to be done by September 30th or before September 30th. I think I had alerted you when this began that I had a conflict with another hearing during the week of September 23rd. And I'm aware of the possibility that our opening statement might arise during that week. If Mr. Hitchings is correct on the timing of this, we can have another lawyer present here to give that opening statement. And all we're doing is an opening statement. We're not going to call witnesses. But it would be preferable if we could defer that until the week of September 23rd, if at all possible.
That makes sense to me. I think we can accommodate this. Do you think it would be, and I'm sorry, you cut out for me for a moment, but I think it was not global because it was probably just me. Would it be preferable to provide your opening statement before? I mean, it sounds like if it's just an opening statement, although slightly awkward, it could be done. We could basically do it at any time. Do you have a preference as to whether we would do it, I guess, the 18th on Wednesday, or whether we would return to it wherever we may be on September 30th?
I don't have a preference, and I would defer to Mr. Hitchings on that, or to the protestants. It doesn't matter to us. It would just be preferable that I get to make the statement as opposed to bringing in somebody else to do it.
And I think that's fine. Let's hear from, thank you for that. Mr. Hitchings, I think you're next up on these several but related issues.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, the authority wouldn't object to state water contractors, TWR, the Bureau, if any or all of them want to do an opening statement on the 18th or out of order, that would be fine with us.
Thank you.
And then I think the other issue I had raised my hand on was the ITP. We understand that the schedule is still expected to result in ITP by mid-October. I think the 15th or the week of the 15th. So our understanding is we're still on that schedule. So there should be plenty of time to circulate that and have that available for the protestants and other parties to view.
Thank you for that update, Mr. Hitchings. Appreciate it. Mr. Busher.
Yeah, thank you. Two thoughts. One, with respect to the state water contractors, our preference would be for Ms. Mandel-Rice or right the Bureau or DWR to, if they're going out of order, to go during site's presentation. I know
Right.
I raised scheduling conflicts with my witness going out of order as well. I'm sympathetic to Ms. Mandel-Rice wanting to be able to be the lawyer who makes that statement, but I don't necessarily want to do it right in the middle of, you know, our tribal panel witness or something like that. So that would be my preference there. And then the second thing I just wanted to note on scheduling, many of the parties, including Baykeeper, are protestants in the Delta Conveyance Project water rights proceeding. And there has been some overlap in the schedule of this and that proceeding, and we would just object to that overlap. We're here, we're doing this one. My preference would probably be to finish this before that starts, but whatever order they come in, we think they need to be separate, not overlapping.
Understood. Thank you. I think with that, Mr. King, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. So could you give me a sense of what our schedule is likely to be in early November, the first half of November? I'm trying to plan a trip to visit my son in Europe, and I kind of want to know what the general schedule is going to be.
I'm trying to decide whether I can make a strong commitment, but I think it's highly unlikely we will be meeting in November. The intent would be we would finish up our case in chief by the end of October. I'm actually considering, and I know we need to do this soon, but whether if we need additional case in chief days, that we would do that between October 10th and October 22nd, if possible. I don't want this to go on forever, and I'm hesitate to add more than one day. October 22nd may be enough, but we'll see where we are.
And then,
but I think you can go ahead, and I think
Okay,
early
wonderful.
November, the plan is a pause, so to speak, in the sense that rebuttal exhibits would be due early December. So,
Okay, great. Thank you.
thank you. So I think I'll look back to you, Ms. Mandel-Rice. Let's plan to have the state water contractors provide an opening statement on Wednesday, on the 18th, if that works for you.
That's fine. I appreciate it. Thank you very
Great.
much.
Thank you. And we'll do it. We'll see where we are, but we'll try to do it whether it's first thing in the morning or at a convenient breaking point if we're between panels, something like that. That might make sense. Chairman Mitchum.
Yeah, I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Amanda Mitchum.
Can you get closer? I'm sorry. Can you get closer to the microphone? I can't hear you very well.
Can you hear me?
It's faint. Is it possible to turn up the volume?
Is that better?
A little bit. Look to the court reporter. Can you hear?
She is a little faint, but I think I can make it out.
All right. Please go ahead.
I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Amanda Mitchum. I'm the vice chairwoman for the tribe. Chairman may be in later, but he has other things going on today.
Thank you. And can you just say your name more slowly for the court reporter, please?
Amanda Mitchum.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Vice Chair Mitchum. Next on my list is to, let's see, where is to turn to Ms. Moore, if she is here. You are here and you're not in a car. Good. You do need to come off mute, and maybe we can have if this is a good time, we can have this conversation.
Okay, it's a good time.
Thank you. I'm glad you're not driving. So thank you, Ms. Moore. I received your email this morning. Just as a matter, I think we can, you're new to this.
Sorry, Ms. Kensey, you froze for me.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, me too.
And I got a note that my internet connection is unstable, and I apologize. Hopefully that won't be a problem today. Am I back?
Yes.
Thank you. Ms. Moore, I received your email of this morning, and just as a logistics matter, I wanted to let you know, and I know you're new to this proceeding, for future reference, all emails should be sent to the service list. And for those in the room, we will of course post the email I received on the FTP site under the correspondence folder. The service list is available on our FTP site, so I'll ask, I believe my team sent out login credentials for our FTP site. There is a folder for the service list, but it's all the email addresses of everyone who's a party to this proceeding and every communication CC to everyone. The idea is that everyone is aware of every communication that occurs. And then
Okay.
also it's quite helpful, and you please do address any communications to the site's email inbox. That's sites-wr-application@waterboards.ca.gov. And the advantage of that for me is my team sees it there and they file it in the proper place and it doesn't get lost in my inbox, which is a mess. So I appreciate
I
that.
need that one more time, please.
The email address is sites, SITES
Yeah.
WR application @waterboards.ca.gov. And that email address is also in the hearing notice that
Okay.
circulated, so you can find it there as well.
Right.
But that way your email will not become lost in my inbox.
Got it.
This one was not, but sometimes it's a mess in there.
All right.
With respect to, I just wanted to clarify a few things on the record. I understand you are making a request to add, as I understood it, to add and please correct my pronunciation if I get it wrong, the Che'i Foca Band of Northeastern Pomo as a party to this proceeding. Is that a correct understanding of your request? And you're on mute again, it looks like.
Gosh darn it, sorry. Che'e Foca. You had it, you were close. And yes, we'd like to be a party. We voted.
And so I think the next step, and I'll look to the room to see if there are any objections. But the next step would be to fill out a notice of intent to appear, and I'll ask Mr. Anderson.
That's the one that's attached to this email where I got the Zoom link.
Correct.
Okay, I can do that.
And in that notice, if you would please, I think there's a space for it, but just explain why the band had not previously requested party status. That's helpful for our records and providing a basis for the late admission, which is something we can consider.
Okay.
And then in terms of participation, is it your intent or your request to put on evidence at this time, or are you requesting to participate for purposes of asking questions on cross-examination?
Possibly both.
And that would be something, please also put in the notice of intent, your request of how to participate. That would be quite helpful. And it does require a formal ruling from me with respect to whether to admit the band as a party. And I'll consider that after I've received the notice of intent to appear. But are there any, if I look to the room, are there any of you who want to comment at this time? To the authority, we can wait until we actually get that notice of intent to appear with the written statement, so you can see it. And then we'll formally address the request at that time. But let's see. Mr. Hitchings, does that make sense to you unless you want to address it now?
I was going to say, I think we'd like to see the notice of intent and the request, including a showing of good cause. So we'd like to reserve any objections we may have. As far as the desire to submit evidence, I think we understand that would be on rebuttal at this point, since the dates and deadlines have already lapsed for cases in chief. But I just wanted to note that as well.
I think we can talk, I'm not making a ruling now, but if that is the direction we go, I think that would make the most sense, is to incorporate that evidence into rebuttal to keep this moving forward. Mr. King.
So I would just say we would support the inclusion of the salt pomo. I apologize for not saying the indigenous name correct, referring to the indigenous name as a party. You know, their tribe was directly north of the project. That's where it is, and also culturally had been salt traders on a salt spring, which is similar to salt pond, to the what we're concerned as salt pond. So it brings a hydrological and a hydrochemical perspective, and allows them to share their tribal ecological knowledge about that unique hydrology to this project.
Thank you, Mr. King. So I think the way to deal with this, Ms. Moore, thank you for bringing this to our attention. If you would please submit, and it's short, it doesn't need to be lengthy, but if you would please submit the notice of intent to appear, and then the authority will have a chance to take a look at it. And then I think we'll pick this up on September 18th.
Right.
And we can address it there. In the meantime, I realize we're going through panels and there's witnesses that are appearing. In the meantime, if it comes up that you would have, if you had been granted party status, would have questions for these witnesses, let me know, and we can deal with that if that comes up. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
With that, are there other procedural issues that we need to address before we get back to fish? Mr. Hitchings.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to follow up. There was a request at last Wednesday for additional parcel information.
Yes.
And we weren't clear exactly what the purpose was for that, whether it was with regard to access or ownership issues for use of facilities or project footprint issues, and also the method that the AHO's office wanted that provided, whether that was just to the AHO or to provide to the state board to support the application, or we weren't quite clear on how you wanted to handle any transmittal of additional parcel information.
Thank you, Mr. Hitchings. I think it's good. We should talk about this more. So this is where I'm coming from, which I was still processing, obviously, on Wednesday after our site visit. I was struck when we were out on the site visit that there are people living in the footprint of the reservoir, which I hadn't fully appreciated. I went back and looked at our noticing procedures for the application, and it's my understanding that we followed the law, the water code, which is to, probably we directed the authority to do it actually, but is to publish notice in county newspapers. And that's the requirement, that's the law. It's a little bit outdated. I think that needs to be reconsidered as to whether that's the best method to notify people. But my understanding, at least from our end, the State Water Board end, is that notice of this hearing and of the application were not provided directly to the landowners within the footprint. Instead, the reliance is on this notice that's published in the newspaper. Again, I think the process we've done is legal, but it does raise some questions for me. So I hadn't come to a decision, but I was considering that whether to provide notice. I did want to ask at an appropriate time. I realize panel 10 is a panel with witnesses who will address the land acquisition issue and some of those issues and what processes the authority has gone through in terms of notifying the landowners or having conversations with the landowners. So I'm a little bit out of the loop as to what had happened, but I did want to, my request was based on that thought that it may be appropriate, even though we're in the middle of this proceeding. I certainly, and I imagine you don't either, I don't want to get to the end of this proceeding and then have a homeowner come in and say, I was never aware that this was going on and I didn't have a chance to participate. So that is quite frankly, that is where I'm coming from. And that is my thought. I don't know if you have any response. Does that help, Mr. Hitchings? Does that clarify at least what the reason for the request?
Yes, that helps. And I think that's what we kind of expected we'd hear as well.
Right. So then in terms of how, and again, I have not come to a decision. I had thought about, well, maybe we should get to panel 10 and then I'll understand more about what has or hasn't been done. But if we do get to the point of transmitting this, I think it would be to the AHO. Again, I understand that there would be personal information possibly involved in this and personal identifying information. My intent would be to keep that confidential and redacted unless someone requested it based on a Public Records Act request. I mean, it's public record, but it's not something we would post on the FTP site proactively, so to speak, but it would be part of this administrative record. My vision was Excel, but I don't know what format you have the information in, but in whatever format you may have that information, assuming that the authority does have that information.
Well, we do have information that was developed and submitted as part of the 404 permit application with the Army Corps, and that does have we have a PDF chart with the parcel information, mailing address, and it does include the landowner name, but no other personal identifying information. It was developed based upon assessor's records that are actually publicly available on Glenn, Colusa, and Yolo County's assessor's office website. So we submitted that to the Corps back in February of 2023, so we could basically provide that attachment to you. It would be in a PDF format, but it's a table that has that information. If that sounds like it hits the mark of what you had in mind.
That makes sense to me, Mr. Hitchings, particularly if this is a table you've already submitted to other agencies. I think that makes sense. I would appreciate that.
And then would you like that sent just to the AHO email address, and then you'll decide how that's ultimately incorporated in the record, in the administrative record?
Yes, please do. You can just send it to me. What we will do, I'll represent to the other parties. Once we receive it, we will, the AHO will send out an email saying we've received this document. We'll take a look at it and see if it makes sense to post a redacted version of some kind, although I suspect not. But if you want a copy, again, it is public record. I just, because of the personally identifying information, I'm not planning to post it on our FTP site.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And are there other on either this or any other procedural issues? Are there other things for us to discuss before we get back to it? With that, then I will look to you, Mr. Hitchings. Do you have your, are your witnesses available and ready to get started this morning?
Yes, I believe everybody's here, so I think they could be pinned on the screen by Ms. Mullen. And I did have another question procedurally, just timing wise. I know we've gotten estimates for this panel. I don't know if any of those have changed in light of the cross that occurred. We had about an hour and a half of it on Wednesday, and I'm just trying to keep our panel 7 witnesses advised if it's possible they could even come on as late this afternoon. That's probably unlikely, but maybe we could confirm that. It would help with us giving them adequate notice.
Yes, so I'll look, first I'll look to you, Mr. Busher. Do you have an estimate of how much cross you have left? I know you had several hours, but
Yeah, at least the morning. We'll see.
at least the morning.
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'm not sure I'll be done by lunch. I might be.
Fair. And then I think there were much shorter estimates, but I'll start with Mr. Reese on behalf of the Delta parties. You gave us an estimate, and now I don't.
We gave an estimate of about an hour, and that's still going to be the case. It's going to be done by Miss Missouri, but we're at about an hour.
Okay.
And just to make sure you can hear me on this format.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, just
Thank
checking.
you.
Thank you.
And I may, this is Don Mooney. I may have about 15 or 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
There may be a couple of other NGO party representatives who have shorter periods of questioning, Mr. Spain or Mr. Schutz as well. So
yes, and Mr. Spain here, I may have 45 minutes, possibly an hour, but not likely longer than that.
And this is Chris Schutz. I have likely an hour.
And Conrad Fisher, about 12 minutes.
Thank you. That's quite specific. Very good. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4. Sounds like we are not likely to get to the next panel today, I think, based on that. If that helps, Mr. Hitchings.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. And it looks like we have everyone here with us. I will remind all of our witnesses that when we met last week, that I administered the oath to all of you, and that oath applies to your testimony today. And with that, I will turn things over to you, Mr. Busher.
Thank you. Good morning again. Thank you again for being here and for answering questions as we go through this. As you heard, it might be a long day, and I appreciate your time and your patience. I think most of my questions today or this morning are going to be for Dr. Wilder and Dr. Greenwood, but if the other three of you have answers or additional answers that you want to add in, please feel free to let me know as we go through this. So I'll start with Dr. Wilder and Dr. Greenwood. Do you agree that the Bay Delta ecosystem is in crisis?
Objection, vague.
Sorry, I have to come off mute myself. Mr. Busher, can you specify, be more clear with that question by referencing whether you're using the phrase in a particular manner?
With respect to the...
Or as defined in a particular, I mean, maybe you're not asking the question this way, but as used by another party or as defined in a particular document?
But let's try it this way. Dr. Wilder, I'll start with you. Just briefly, can you describe for me what your opinion is of the health of the Bay Delta ecosystem with respect to native fish?
Sure. There are certainly several stressors that have, injured the native populations, and they are certainly lower than they were pre-European times.
Dr. Greenwood, can you answer the same question?
I would say that judging by indices of abundance, for example, some of the species are at low values relative to historical values earlier in the time series of the monitoring that may have occurred.
And when you say earlier in the time series for monitoring, is that the last 60 years, give or take?
Depends on the particular survey that's being considered, but some surveys I think do go back 60 years. Other ones are more recent. But in the case of some species, I think the indices of abundance are relatively low compared to earlier in the time series that's available.
Is it fair to say that for most of those indices of abundance, the time series that's available is no more than 60 years?
I'm not thinking of any that are longer than 60 years.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Mullen, could we put Baykeeper Exhibit 96 on the screen, please? While she does that, Dr. Greenwood and Dr. Wilder, how long have the two of you worked on issues related to the Bay Delta ecosystem?
Go ahead, Dr. Greenwood.
Sorry. For myself, since around about 2009, 2010.
And for me, since 2005.
Thank you. And Ms. Mullen, if we could just zoom out a little bit so we can see the title cover page of this document. This is Baykeeper 96. It is a copy of the State Water Resources Control Board development of flow criteria for the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta ecosystem, prepared pursuant to the Delta Reform Act of 2009 and was published in 2010. Are you generally aware of the existence of this document?
I'm generally aware of it, yes.
And Dr.
Myself
Wilder?
as well. Yeah, myself as well.
And Ms. Mullen, could we go to page 13 of the PDF? In the first paragraph, there, starting with the third sentence. The Delta is in ecological crisis, resulting in high levels of conflict that affect the sustainability of existing water policy in California. Several species of fish have been listed as protected species under the California ESA and under the federal ESA. Do you agree with those two sentences, Dr. Wilder?
Yes.
Dr. Greenwood, to you?
Certainly the second sentence. I think the first sentence, I wouldn't necessarily characterize it as crisis if I was describing it myself. I would probably I would probably focus on, some of the type of language we just discussed in the responses to prior questions. So I'd probably try and frame it in terms of the status of species in relation to, indices of abundance being relatively low compared to where they were.
And is that status one of the reasons that several fish species have been listed as protected under state and federal law?
I believe it is.
Dr. Wilder, you responded at the beginning of this conversation that there are several stressors. Do you agree that the primary stressor is diversions and lack of freshwater flow?
Not necessarily. I think it's way more complicated than that.
Dr. Greenwood, do you agree that the primary stressor causing those reduced indices of abundance is lack of diversions and freshwater flow?
I'm not sure. I think it's potentially a contributing factor, but I'm not sure about being primary.
Okay. We could scroll down to the top of the next page, please, Ms. Mullen. The top sentence here, right before section 1.1, says the best available science, and this is published in 2010, suggests that current flows are insufficient to protect public trust resources. Do you agree with that sentence, Dr. Wilder?
Objection vague as to time frame, seasonality, year type.
I'm happy to respond.
Overrule the, I'm thinking, yes, that was the thought bubble. I'm going to overrule the objection with the caveat that we're talking about the specific text here in the document, and the witnesses have stated that they're generally aware of this document, but I'll leave it to the witnesses to caveat as appropriate.
Yeah, the first thing I'll say is that document is 14 years old, and we've gone through a couple BIOPS since then, so lots of flows of and regulations have changed. So in terms of this specific statement, again, I think it's complicated as Mr. Hitchings indicated, and I agree with it. It certainly depends on a variety of factors, location, time of year, water year type, all of that.
Ms. Mullen, can we put exhibit AHO 271 on the screen, please? AHO 271 is a scientific basis report published in 2017 by the State Water Board in connection with the Bay Delta update. Are you generally familiar with the 2017 scientific basis report?
I am.
And you, Dr. Greenwood?
I'm somewhat familiar with it.
And could we go to page 28 of the PDF, please? And zoom in on the middle paragraph that starts as described in chapter 2, please. Awesome. Thank you, Ms. Mullen. Dr. Wilder, about halfway through that paragraph, right after the citation to Rosengert, the sentence that reads, native fish and wildlife in the Bay Delta watershed have been significantly impacted by these reductions of flow, with many species currently on the verge of extinction. Do you agree with that sentence?
Again, I don't think it's as black and white as it is conveyed right here. No.
Okay. Do you agree that many species are currently on the verge of extinction?
I think there may be a couple, but many is, I would say, is an overstatement.
All right. What species do you believe are on the verge of extinction? Native fish species in the Bay Delta.
I would say there are times when I've thought that Delta smelt and winter run Chinook salmon may be on the verge of extinction.
Any other species?
No.
Dr. Greenwood, well, hold on, let me finish up. Dr. Wilder, with respects to Delta smelt and winter run Chinook salmon, do you believe that they have been significantly impacted by reductions of flow?
I think it's one of several contributing factors for both species.
Okay, let's start with the winter run. Are there any bigger contributing factors?
I think it's very obvious that if there weren't dams in the system, that they would be doing much better. So I would say that the construction of dams is a bigger stressor on the species than flow.
Okay. Any other, besides dams and diversions of flow? Any bigger factors that are significantly impacting winter run Chinook salmon?
No.
And with respect to Delta smelt, are there, do you agree that they have been significantly impacted by reductions in flow?
I believe that they have been impacted by flow, but to say that it's significant as a single contributing factor, I would say no.
So your opinion with respect to Delta smelt is that their status as on the verge of extinction is not the result of reduced flow?
No, that's not what I said. I said it's reduced flow is one of the many contributing factors.
Okay. Are there any larger contributing factors to the status of Delta smelt?
I can't quantify it, but there's been reductions in turbidity. Temperature seems to be a factor.
Any other contributing factors? Sorry, go ahead.
I'm not a Delta smelt expert, so I'm speaking a little out of my league here. But I would say that there are likely others that I'm just not thinking of right now.
Okay. Do flows impact turbidity in the Delta?
Can, yes,
Do flows impact temperature in the delta?
they can. And just like turbidity, several other factors can contribute to changing either of those factors.
Is one of the ways that flows has an effect on fish in the Bay Delta by modifying those other things like turbidity and temperature?
Injection, vague, compound.
Why don't you break it down, Mr. Busher, please?
One of the ways that flows affect fish in the Delta by modifying turbidity.
Yes, it's possible.
Is it correct or is it possible?
Flow can affect turbidity, yes.
And does flow also affect, well, is one of the ways that flows impacts fish in the Delta by modifying temperature?
Yes.
Thank you. Dr. Greenwood, do you agree with the sentence we started with here? The second portion of it, at least, that many species are currently on the verge of extinction?
I think it's just judging by indices of abundance, it may be the case, but I think that I'd probably really need to know criteria for what's being regarded as extinction. I think there's kind of a general sense of extinction, but then there can also be criteria for particular duration of time that indices may have been at particular values, that type of thing. So based on that, I'm not sure.
Can you describe for me what besides indices of abundance are important in terms of evaluating whether a species is on the verge of extinction?
Well, I think indices of abundance are probably the main tool, if you will, and derived things like the replacement rate of the population, which is, I guess, mostly a function of indices of abundance as well. There can also be, I guess, for example, the effective population size, which is not necessarily something that's the same as the overall population size.
Okay. So with respect to native fish populations in the Bay Delta, are there any where you believe the indices of abundance demonstrate that those populations are on the verge of extinction?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, there may be particular criteria associated with judging what extinction is in relation to those indices of abundance. Delta smelt has the lowest relative to its historical indices of abundance, and they have been at 0 for some surveys in recent years. So if judged by that metric, then that could be. But as I say, again, it's a case of specifically thinking about what the criteria might be for judging extinction.
Dr. Greenwood, do you agree that let me pause for a second. When you say indices of abundance, is that a shorthand for like population of fish or total number of fish?
Indices of abundance would be generally time series of consistently collected year over year, perhaps, abundance that can then perhaps give an inference of population status. But it's not, actually, can you repeat the last part of your question? I'm just trying to frame it
No,
back.
I think that was very helpful, right? So it's an indices of abundance is a consistent measurement of, right, the number of fish that can then be used to extrapolate out to what the population of fish might be.
Can be, but that can be challenging. As far as there have been changes over time in some of the factors that could affect, for example, the catch efficiency of surveys. So if everything remained the same as far as how well the surveys performed over time, then the annual index of abundance would be a consistent measure year over year. But in some cases, there may be changes that could complicate the interpretation of whether, in fact, that is, as you were suggesting, extrapolating out to a population level. So caution has to be applied, I guess, to some extent.
That's helpful. Thank you. Do you, well, do you agree that water diversions and reductions in flow are significant contributing factors into the reductions you described in those indices of abundance?
They may be, among others.
And is that a yes or a no? I mean, is it a significant contributing factor, even if there are others?
I'm not sure if it's a significant contributing factor, but it's one factor, perhaps.
Okay. Can you identify for me any more significant contributing factors to those reductions in abundance?
I think it's challenging to rank, if you will, in terms of significance. Which species, sorry, are we talking about? Delta smelt? Or
well, I was asking generally about native fish in the Bay Delta. Let's start with, is it correct to say that the answer to, well, with respect to native fish in the Bay Delta, right? Can you identify for me other similarly significant or similarly important factors to their reductions in abundance as reductions in flow?
Like I just said, it's challenging. When we talk about similarly, that implies that there's some knowledge about the relative importance, which I think I mentioned. I'm not sure about the relative importance, but just in terms of factors that could be involved other than flow-related ones. Temperature may be one, for example, in the case of Delta smelt that Dr. Wilder mentioned. Food availability is another one that's potentially the case. Dr. Wilder mentioned turbidity or suspended sediment. That would be another one. So there are different examples, but I think it's challenging to rank these, as it were.
Okay. So let me try this way. Do you agree with Dr. Wilder that flow impacts temperature?
It can do, but I think it's nuanced as far as flow affecting temperature. I think depending, in the case of the delta, I think that the temperature related effects may vary depending on where you are in the delta. So flow coming into the delta from upstream is likely to be able to have more of an effect closer to where it's entering the delta than farther downstream where there may be other influences.
Okay, let's try the inverse, right? Does water temperature affect flow?
Water temperature affect flow within the delta?
Sure.
Not familiar with that.
Okay. So if one is impacting the other, flow is impacting temperature, not the opposite, correct?
Flow potentially can impact temperature to the limited extent that I just mentioned, depending on where in the delta we're talking about.
Do you agree that in the rivers upstream, Sacramento River upstream of the delta, flow impacts temperature?
Generally speaking, yes.
And in the delta or the estuary, does flow impact food availability?
It can do.
And does flow impact turbidity?
It can do, but there are other factors that I think, depending on where you are, can be of greater importance. For example, the effects of winds.
Ms. Mullen, could we put AHO 272 on the screen, please? Dr. Greenwood, this document that Ms. Mullen is pulling up is the 2018, July 2018 framework for the Sacramento Delta update to the Bay Delta Plan. Are you generally aware or familiar with this document?
Could you show the front cover if possible?
I think this is the front page. This is the version, and it's a state water board document about the Bay Delta Plan from July of 2018. If that helps.
I don't recall seeing this.
Can we go down to the bottom of page 5? Dr. Wilder, the last sentence on this document, and then we'll go on to the top of page 6, says, while there are also other factors involved in the decline of these species, water diversions and the corresponding reduction in flows those diversions cause are significant contributing factors. A significant and compelling amount of scientific information indicates that restoration of natural flow functions is needed now to halt and reverse these declines in an integrated fashion with physical habitat improvements. Do you agree with those two sentences?
Objection compound.
Let's break it down, Mr. Busher. It seems easy enough. We can start with the first.
Let's start with the first sentence. Do you agree that while there are also other factors involved in the decline of these species, water diversions and the corresponding reduction in flows those diversions cause are significant contributing factors?
Yes, but again, it's not as simple as that. It really varies in time and space and with multiple other factors involved.
Well, I don't mean to suggest it's simple. I just want to know if you agree that that is a significant contributing factor.
Well, what I would say is it can be. But it depends on a lot of things. Under certain conditions and time and space, yes. Under other conditions, no.
How do you draw that line? Right, when flow is not a contributing factor, or when flow is not or is not a contributing factor.
Well, it's extreme, but if there were a major disease and major die-off of the entire the entire native species population, then that would not be water or flow would not be a significant factor into that scenario. It's obviously extreme, but there are certainly other scenarios where that would fit.
Okay. Are you familiar with such massive die-offs of native fish that are unrelated to flow or water temperature in the Bay Delta recently?
No, although I'm not a Bay Delta expert.
And Dr. Greenwood, do you agree with the first sentence that was at the bottom of page 5? While there are also other factors involved in the decline of these species, water diversions and the corresponding reduction in flows those diversions cause are significant contributing factors.
Sorry, could I see the sentence again?
Yeah, Ms. Mullen, it's thank you very much. It's the last 2 lines of this page.
I think, as I mentioned earlier, they could be contributing factors. As for significance, I'm not sure.
Okay.
It's a fairly general statement.
Okay. Dr. Greenwood, is it important when you're trying to determine whether flows are sufficient or insufficient to take a granular kind of species by species approach to that?
It could be, yes.
And is it important to look at, again, right from a granular perspective, different reaches or stretches of the river in terms of those impacts?
In some cases, it may be.
And is it correct that what may be protective of one life stage of one species may not be protective of a different life stage of a different species for the native fish in the Bay Delta ecosystem?
It may be the case.
Ms. Mullen, can we go to AHO 279, please? Dr. Greenwood and Dr. Wilder both, this is the September 2023 draft staff report for the Phase 2 Sacramento River and Delta of the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan. Are you generally aware of this document?
Yes.
I don't think let's see. I don't think I'm aware of it, but I don't think I've actually looked at it.
Thank you. And could we go to page 82 of the PDF, please? And zoom in on the bottom paragraph, please. Dr. Wilder, I don't know, a little bit more than halfway through the paragraph, right after the discussion of the various million acre feet of flow, there's a sentence that starts existing regulatory minimum delta outflows. Do you see that?
Yes.
The sentence says existing regulatory minimum delta outflows would not be protective of the ecosystem. Do you agree with that statement?
Again, I'm not a delta expert, so I'm here to talk about upstream effects. Perhaps Dr. Greenwood could address this more properly to get you the information that you're looking for.
Okay, well, let me talk about the upstream question. You understand that the Bay Delta Plan update, which this draft staff report is a part of, deals with the Sacramento River, not just the Delta, correct?
Yes.
And that the regulatory minimums apply in the Sacramento, or there are regulatory minimums that apply in the Sacramento River and not just the Delta that exist and that are proposed to change, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Do you think, with respect to upstream of the Delta, existing regulatory minimum, well, let me try that differently. Do you think that existing regulatory minimum Delta outflows are protective of the upstream ecosystem?
I guess I'm having a difficult time conceptualizing this because a lot goes on between upstream and delta outflow. There are a lot of diversions, a lot of inputs and outputs along the river, as well as other rivers that are inputs.
Okay. Dr. Greenwood, do you agree that existing regulatory minimum Delta outflows would not be protective of the ecosystem?
I was just looking at that. Is that meant to be a statement in and of itself, or seems like it's leading to additional within the sentence?
So please read the whole sentence or paragraph, whatever portion of it you think you need to understand. That is a long compound sentence that if I ask you about as a whole thing, I think your lawyer's going to object, and I'm not sure I'd blame it. So I'm trying to break this apart into the existing clauses in the sentence.
Would you like me to read it out loud?
You don't need to. I just want to know if you agree whether existing regulatory minimum Delta outflows would not be protective of the ecosystem.
I'm struggling with would not be protective of the ecosystem because it seems to require the rest of the sentence to go with it.
Okay, well then let's take the whole sentence. That sentence reads, existing regulatory minimum Delta outflows would not be protective of the ecosystem. And without additional in-stream flow protections, existing flows may be reduced in the future, particularly with climate change and additional water development, absent additional minimum in-stream flow requirements that ensure flows are preserved in stream when needed for the reasonable protection of fish and wildlife. Do you agree with the sentence?
It's possible. So ultimately, you're interested in the would not be protective part. I think if there was less flow, then there is the potential for that to have a negative effect. So if that's what is being considered within that sentence, then that would be the case. That could be the case.
Okay. We put exhibit Baykeeper 82 on the screen, please. Thank you very much, Ms. Mullen. Dr. Greenwood, exhibit Baykeeper 82 is a copy of a January 19, 2024 letter from the United States EPA to the State Water Board in response to the draft staff report AHO 279 that we just looked at. I want to look at page 4 of the PDF here. And if we could look at the last paragraph with the 2 footnotes as well at the bottom of the page. The first sentence of that paragraph concludes that substantially more flow is needed in the Delta and the Sacramento-San Joaquin watersheds to support aquatic life. Dr. Greenwood, do you agree with that statement?
Objection. Vague. Just because it's written in a document does not make the statement in the document not vague. If that question was asked without the document in front. So I'm objecting on that basis.
Understood. Let's see.
I don't know. Substantially more flow is needed in the Delta and the watersheds to support aquatic life does not strike me as particularly vague. I think the witness should answer.
Well, I'll allow overruled to the extent the witness can answer.
It's fairly, I mean, the supporting aquatic life is a bit vague in terms of how that's being defined. That could be defined in different ways.
So you don't know whether you agree or disagree?
I mean, there is aquatic life in the Delta and Sacramento San Joaquin watersheds, so life is supported.
Fair enough. Do you think that the current status of the life in the Delta and the Sacramento San Joaquin watersheds, aquatic life, protects those public trust resources?
I'm sorry, can you...
Objection, vague.
I'll move on. So if we continue down that paragraph, Dr. Greenwood, do you agree that scientific consensus indicates that native fish population abundance is positively associated with flow volumes?
It's species specific, not necessarily the case for all native fish populations. There are correlations for some species.
For the 6 species listed in the prior sentence, do you agree that the scientific consensus indicates that those fish population, for those fish, abundance is positively associated with flow volumes?
Let's see. I think there is some evidence for positive correlations for, I think, some life stages of some species.
Let's take these one at a time then. Do you agree that the scientific consensus indicates that delta smelt abundance is positively associated with flow volume?
There is some evidence for some life stages having positive correlations in terms of the survival of the life stages.
Is that a yes then?
I think, at least to some extent, it's possible, yes.
Do you agree that scientific consensus indicates that longfin smelt population abundance is positively associated with flow volumes?
There have been a number of published studies showing correlations between.
So again, I'm sorry.
Between, for example, delta outflow and indices of abundance of longfin smelt.
And that as delta outflow increases, those indices of abundance increase, correct?
That's the correlation.
And as delta outflow decreases, the indices of abundance also decrease?
That's the correlation.
Okay. Do you agree that scientific consensus indicates that green sturgeon population abundance is positively associated with flow?
That species, I'm not sure about. I think we have some evidence for relatively higher catches in monitoring in the delta with wetter years, but I don't, at least what I'm aware of, hasn't been as I guess extensively documented as maybe some of the other species that have been studied.
Okay. Do you agree that the scientific consensus indicates that native fish try all 4 runs of Chinook salmon population abundance are positively associated with flow volumes?
I can think of positive correlations for salmon, some life stages with flow volume.
Okay, and all 4 runs of salmon, Chinook salmon?
I think that some of the studies I'm thinking of, I believe they do include the different runs.
Okay. And then with respect to Central Valley steelhead, do you agree that the scientific consensus indicates that population abundance is positively associated with flow?
I've seen studies that correlate aspects of the life history positively with flow.
And then last, with respect to white sturgeon, do you agree that the white sturgeon fish population abundance is positively associated with flow?
There are parts of the life cycle that appear to be positively correlated with flow.
You testified at the beginning of today's session that for many of the native fish species, their indices of abundance have declined since those indices began being tracked. Is that true for the 6 fish species identified in the parenthetical on, where are we? Baykeeper 82, page 4.
This is the page we're looking at, sorry.
Correct. The 6 fish species, and then there's the parenthetical, are listed as proposed or threatened, proposed as threatened or endangered. Do you agree that those 6 species, the indices of abundance you describe, show declining populations?
Well, the indices of abundance are lower than they were historically in recent years for delta smelt and longfin smelt. I don't recall specifically for the salmonids. I think they are relatively low compared to historically. Central Valley steelhead, there isn't as much monitoring for that species. So I'm not recalling the status of that. And then for green sturgeon, I'm not recalling the specifics of the status.
Thank you. Do you agree that the winter run Chinook salmon used to support a fishery?
It may have. I don't recall specifically.
Dr. Wilder, do you know, can you answer that with any more specificity? Do you agree that the winter run Chinook salmon used to support a fishery?
It was included in the ocean fishery, and up until 2 years ago was, and very well could in the future as well.
And it used to support a tribal fishery as well, correct?
I believe the tribal community caught winter run Chinook salmon, yes, and harvested them.
Okay. Same with respect to spring run Chinook salmon, used to support a fishery, correct?
Yeah, in the same way.
And then those 2 species, winter run and spring run, are now listed as either endangered or threatened, correct?
Yes, correct.
And do you agree that that means that they are at risk of extinction?
Can you define at risk? Because I don't think that just because a species is considered for listing necessarily means it's on the verge of extinction.
So those are actually both listed, correct? Spring run and winter run Chinook salmon?
Yes, federally.
Okay.
Yes.
So in your opinion, based on your 20 years of work on the Bay Delta ecosystem, do you agree that those 2 species, winter run and spring run Chinook salmon, are at risk of extinction?
I'd say winter run probably has a higher risk than spring run, but
Does spring, oh, I'm sorry.
But neither of them are, I would say, on the verge of extinction.
How do you draw that line between at risk and on the verge?
Yeah, that's why I was asking you for a definition. I think it's, imminence is on the verge of. In other words, it's, all but a done deal.
With respect to fall run or late fall run Chinook salmon, you agree that those runs of salmon historically supported fisheries, correct?
Yes, and currently it's a mixed stock fishery, so all of these species could support the fishery, including winter and spring run. I just wanted to clarify that we have we have some ways to distinguish between the runs and try to avoid harvesting them during the year. But in the end, it is a mixed stock fishery, so they're all, able to be caught in the ocean.
You understand that the fall run Chinook salmon fishery was closed the last 2 years?
Yes.
Do you agree that that was a result of inadequate flows and high river temperatures in years prior to the last two?
Objection, vague, compound.
Let's break it down, Mr. Busher.
Do you agree that one of the causes of the closure of the fall run Chinook salmon fishery in 2023 and 2024 was inadequate flows in prior years?
I believe it was because there were, there was low egg survival for winter run Chinook.
Well, I'm going to focus on fall run, which supports the fishery because it's not an endangered species at this stage. So, do you have any understanding as to the cause of the closure of the fall run Chinook salmon fishery in 2023 or 2024?
Sorry, I may not be understanding, but the fishery as a whole, it being a mixed stock fishery, I believe is driven by low numbers of all the races.
Okay. Do you have any opinion about the cause of low numbers of all the races of salmon that led to the closure of the fishery in 2023 or 2024?
Again, I believe it was low egg mortality, likely caused by temperature.
And I'm sorry, you said low egg mortality. Do you mean low egg survival?
Sorry, yes, thank you.
Okay. And then likely caused by temperature, you said?
Yes.
Do you agree that inadequate flow was also a contributing factor in that low egg survival?
Yes, I do. It was, yeah.
And those were the temperatures and flows at times when the fish that would have been caught in 23 and 24 were out migrating from the river, correct?
It was the year that they were spawned and became eggs, and yes, fry, etc.
Thank you. So I want to shift gears, and I want to be cognizant that it's been a little bit more than 90 minutes.
It's
happy to
probably
keep
a good
going
time
or
for a
take a
break.
break.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Busher. Thanks for flagging that. Let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break, and then we will come back and pick up. See you at 10:45.
Thank you.
All right, it's 10:45. Once we get everyone regathered on video, we can pick up. And I'll look to you, Ms. Cott. Please let me know if you're ready to go back on the record.
Hi, one moment. Give me 5 seconds.
No problem.
Okay, I'm all set.
Great. Then with that, I will turn back to you, Mr. Busher.
Thank you, Hearing Officer Kinsey. I want to turn now to the diversion threshold that was proposed by sites in its ITP application at Wilkins Slough. And forgive me, I think these are questions for Dr. Greenwood, but between either Dr. Greenwood or Dr. Wild, or feel free to answer whoever the appropriate one is if I'm asking the wrong one of you. The 10,000 CFS Wilkins Slough threshold or condition is intended to limit or avoid impacts on salmon, correct?
Objection, misstatement of the bypass criteria.
Can we bring up the bypass criteria? Do you have a good reference for it, either Mr. Busher or Mr. Hitchings? Or proposed bypass criteria, I should say.
I can make this simple, right? I believe Mr. Busher's question was 10,000 CFS. It's 10,700 CFS.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Thank you.
I apologize. So Dr. Greenwood, the 10,700 CFS proposed criteria is designed to limit impacts on salmon, correct?
Generally speaking, yes.
And what is that flow criteria based on?
It's based on a published study.
And that is by Cyril Michel from 2021, correct?
Michel et al. To 2021. Yes, I believe that's right.
I'm sorry, could you spell that, please? I could not find that on the last day, and that would be very helpful. The name.
I can do it if you like. Michel, M-I-C-H-E-L.
And was there a first name?
Cyril, C-Y-R-I-L.
Thank you so
Ms.
much.
Mullen, I'm sorry. Ms. Mullen, if we could put Baykeeper 59 on the screen. Dr. Greenwood, you're familiar with that paper, correct?
I'm familiar with it.
I'm going to start with page 5. Figure 2 here on the screen identifies what's called the region of interest. Can you describe what that means, please, as it relates to this paper?
Sorry, could you make it a little smaller so I could see the... There we go. I believe this was the focal study region for this particular study. So the assessment of survival was done in focusing largely on this particular region. Sorry.
Okay, and this is a portion of the region of interest is just a portion of the kind of migration path that the salmon will take, correct?
It's a portion of the migration path that some salmon may take.
And this paper is primarily about fall run Chinook salmon, correct?
I believe this one, I'd have to look in the methods. I think this one discussed over several different runs.
Fair enough. That is true. It does discuss others. If we can look at table 1 on the next page, I think that'll help. So there are in table 1 the release groups identified. Do you agree that most of the fish, the 2,400 fish included in the study, are fall runs Chinook salmon?
So you said 2,400 are fall run?
Most of the 2,400 included in the study are fall run, correct?
Appears to be.
And there's just one release group of winter run, correct?
There is one.
In terms of understanding the impacts on winter run Chinook salmon, do you agree that you would need to study more release groups than are studied in this paper to know whether they respond to the same flow levels as fall run Chinook salmon do?
Not necessarily.
Okay. Is it your testimony that the 199 winter run salmon are sufficient to demonstrate the impact of the flows analyzed by this paper on winter run fish?
They provide some information regarding the effects of flows on winter run. We have considered other analyses looking at flow effects on winter run as well as in the course of our effects analyses for this project.
Okay. And do you think in order to understand the impacts on spring run Chinook salmon, do you think that there need to be more fish than were analyzed in this study?
Not necessarily.
Basically the same answer as the winter run?
Yes, similar answer.
Okay. And this paper, only smolt were studied in terms of life stage, correct?
I believe that's the main life stage. I'd have to review it in more detail just to see how they were being characterized. Sometimes the distinction between smolts and other earlier life stages can be made on lengths, for example. It could also be physiological state as well. I would need to refresh my memory as far as what it's specifically referring to.
Okay. And when we're talking about smolt, like those are juveniles that are ready to migrate downstream to the ocean, correct?
I believe that's how they could be characterized.
And do you have a sense of how big those fish are?
General sense, it would be challenging to give a specific number, I would say. Generally, I would probably be looking up values just to confirm what sort of sizes they may be.
Okay. Do you believe it is likely that other life stages of Chinook salmon would show different impacts from flows than the fish studied in Michel's paper, Baykeeper 59?
It's possible.
Do you think it's likely?
To some degree, maybe.
Okay. Turning to the substance of the paper, you agree that the findings that are presented here are threshold findings, Dr. Greenwood?
Objection vague.
So I'll try that differently. That's fair. With respect to the predicted survival as a function of flows at Wilkins Slough that are presented in the paper, do you agree that they're presented as thresholds?
Some of the results are presented as thresholds.
And if we could go to page 10 of the PDF and look at figure 6. The bottom one there, thank you. So figure 6 shows flow at Wilkins Slough and survival through the region of interest that we looked at the beginning of the paper. And the caption describes it as thresholds of predicted survival. Can you describe what a threshold means in this context?
In this context, it would mean as flow goes above a particular threshold value, then there would be, or below, as flow passes through a threshold, the results of this study suggest that there would be a change in survival, which may be, for example, if increasing above a threshold, in general, the survival increases. Decreasing below the threshold, the survival generally decreases between the approximate values, between the values that we see there on the vertical axis.
Okay. So is it right to understand that, well, let me take a look at the values on the vertical axis. That's the survival through the region of interest. And there is a horizontal line at about 0.2. Do you see that?
I see it.
Okay. And then there's gray fill around that horizontal line, and the figure caption describes those as a 95% confidence interval. Can you explain what that is, please?
That would be a measure of the, I guess, statistical uncertainty or variation around the estimate of the coefficient or the prediction coming out from the statistical model used to describe the data.
Okay. And the presentation of data like this with error bars is common in ecological analyses like this, correct?
Based on my experience, that's true.
Okay. And that is designed to express that uncertainty that comes from both potential error in measurement or variance in natural conditions, correct?
I believe that's a reasonable characterization.
Okay, thank you. So the vertical lines here are the flow CFS thresholds that the paper describes, correct?
I believe so.
And we have a vertical line at 10,712 CFS, correct?
There is a vertical line at 10,712 CFS.
And when we look at, as you described it, right, when you cross that threshold, right, above that, survival is 50%. Below that, survival looks like it's just under 20%, correct?
That's the prediction from the statistical model.
And it was that prediction and that model that was the basis for the diversion criteria that sites proposed, correct?
That's the basis for it.
Do you have an understanding for why the diversion criteria was not proposed at 10,712, which is the threshold in the paper?
Mr. Speranza can speak to more on this as necessary. My understanding was really that it's reflecting the operational feasibility, if you will, in terms of meeting a very specific 12 CFS value above 10,700 CFS.
That's correct.
Mr. Speranza, let me follow up on that real quick then. Why is it operationally feasible to meet 10,700 but not 10,712, right? They're both specific numbers.
I don't think that it's not operationally feasible. I think that when we're talking about diverting from the Sacramento River from two different diversion locations that are 60, 100 miles upstream, that trying to predict to the 12 CFS foot, which is a fraction of a tenth of an inch at the Wilkins Slough notch there, it seemed more realistic for us to identify 10,700 CFS as an approximation of that 10,712.
Okay. Why is it more realistic to meet 10,700 than 10,712?
It's a good question.
Thank you.
That's a good question. I think given enough time, it wouldn't be. I think once we get a better understanding of the relationship of flow between our diversions, a better understanding of who's pulling water out from after our diversions and that relationship to Wilkins Slough, I think it's fair to say that 10,712 would be as feasible, under future conditions and given additional study. That's part of the reason we're looking at it in the adaptive management plan. That 10,712 and 10,700 would be approximately the same.
Okay. And if you are going to, well, under the assumption that it is somehow easier to meet, right, a rounder looking number than a more specific looking number, why not go up to 10,725 instead of down to 10,700?
I can't tell you why that decision was made. I know that many different thresholds were identified. I mean, just the fact that you've identified the 95% confidence intervals, identify the fact that there is inherent error in that model, in those predictions. And so, it could be 10,712, it could be, 10,689 and still have the same confidence interval.
So I agree with you. You agree that on that vertical line, there is likely also a 95% confidence interval from the data, even though it's not presented in the figure?
Yes, there's always error in models, correct.
Did you do anything to follow?
Statistical,
I'm sorry.
Especially when there's statistical predictions.
And I apologize. Either Mr. Spranza or Dr. Greenwood, did you do anything to follow up with Dr. Michel to ask what that 95% confidence interval on the flow threshold is?
I know we had several discussions with Dr. Michel. He was on a number of our agency calls. I can't remember the exact discussions about confidence intervals, though it's been some time.
Yeah, I haven't followed up with Dr. Michel. I've just reviewed the paper.
Thank you. And is it fair, though, Dr. Greenwood, in your experience, that there is a 95%, like Mr. Spranza suggested, right? A 95% confidence interval around that vertical line?
There could be. I would need to see any additional details on modeling to confirm that.
Fair enough. Thank you. And because this is a threshold finding, right, it's especially important to ensure that the actual flows are above whatever that actual threshold is, correct?
I would say at least meeting the threshold, not going below it.
Okay. And so if the actual threshold is 10, 7, 12, right, flows of 10, 700, you would not expect those to provide the benefit.
Based on this statistical model, that may not be the case. I think, as Mr. Spranza indicated, this is something that through additional investigation, the I guess feasibility will be looked at more. And I think more broadly speaking, as I indicated in my written testimony, the issue of flows and how they may affect, in this case, for example, juvenile salmonid survival, is something that is part of it's recognized by the project and is something that would be addressed through the adaptive management.
And is it correct to say that below whatever the threshold is, the migrating juvenile salmon, well, I'm sorry, let me start over. Is it correct that below the threshold, that as we move down from the threshold, I apologize, that the likelihood that migrating juvenile salmon would receive no benefit from the flows in the river increases?
Objection, vague.
That's fair. There were too many negatives. I'll try that again. As we move from right to left on figure 6 across that threshold, is it correct that the farther we move down in CFS, the more likely it is that juvenile salmon receive no benefit from those flows?
I'm sorry, where was our starting point?
We've got the threshold line at 10,712, correct? And as we move, right, from higher than that across that line to lower than that, left across the graph, is it correct to say that the farther left we move, the less likely it is that the outmigrating juvenile salmon receive any benefit from the flow?
I'm not sure about the word benefit, but based on this statistical model, the survival through the region of interest, the model would predict it to be lower, as indicated by the lines on the figure.
And when you say lower, as indicated by the lines, right, 2.7 times lower, give or take. It's on the right side, yeah.
Sorry, the right side of.
Just to the right of figure 6 in that paragraph, it describes a 2.7-fold increase in survival.
Okay.
As you get to that 10, 7, 12.
That's what the text states. I haven't independently verified the arithmetic on it.
Okay. And we've been talking about this as a threshold. I want to contrast that with what I'm going to call a linear relationship that shows, right, increasing success as slows increase. Do you understand the difference between the threshold and the linear relationship as I've described it?
I understand the difference between those. I think you said success. Are you meaning survival or?
Yeah, that's fine.
I do understand the difference.
Okay. Is it fair to say that the threshold here identified by Michel only applies to the region of interest that was studied?
It may do. That was their focal study region.
Okay. Do you believe that the data in Michel's paper supports application of this threshold in anywhere outside of the region of interest that they studied?
I wouldn't apply it that way.
It applies within the region that they studied. There may be different papers analyzing different regions, correct?
There may be different papers. I wouldn't attempt to use this relationship in other regions.
And is it correct that just because there's a threshold of 10,712 from this paper at Wilkins Slough, right, that doesn't say anything about whether, right, the kind of equivalent of that flow at Freeport, for example, would or would not be protected, right?
In and of itself, it doesn't. It would require additional analysis to look at that, as we've done in our impact analyses, our effects analyses.
And when you've looked at those other impacts and studies and potential effects from other papers and studies, is it fair to say that most of those other papers in assessing the impacts of flow on salmonids show a linear relationship, not a threshold relationship?
I believe, of the papers that I've reviewed, I don't recall any of them having examined linear versus threshold responses. I believe the ones I've seen that I'm aware of that address this type of issue seem to focus solely on linear responses or linear type responses, not threshold responses.
Michel's findings are unique or almost unique in that respect, correct?
I'm not recalling any others that may have looked at it specifically that way.
So I want to turn to some of those other studies then that you referenced. If we could pull up exhibit Baykeeper 29, please. And Dr. Greenwood, while that's coming up, this is a paper by Henderson et al. From 2018. And are you familiar with this study?
I'm familiar with this study.
Okay. And we could go to page 6 of the PDF, figure 2. This is the top half of the page here. Dr. Greenwood, if you can, and we can zoom in on the top half, but if you can you just briefly describe what figure 2 is presenting? And if not, I'm happy to take a crack at it and we can get there together.
I mean, I can certainly read the caption. It's a map depicting reach-specific survival estimates per 10 kilometers for 2008 to 2010. Colors represent per reach survival risk, and standard error is represented as the gray buffer surrounding each reach. The values adjacent to each reach represent the survival estimate for a given reach per 10 kilometers from our full survival model.
And if well, I don't know if you can do it from here. Can you estimate where the reach that Michelle studied, or the portion that Michelle studied, is on this? If not, there's another figure a couple pages earlier that we can look at.
I would probably need to see them lined up side by side just to be clear.
Okay. Let me try it this way. Is it fair to say that Michelle studied just a portion of the entire reach of the river, or a portion of the reaches of the river that were studied by Henderson?
I believe that's correct. I would need to see them lined up just to be certain, but I believe that's right.
And is it correct to understand that the results reported by Henderson show that survival of winter run Chinook salmon smolt out migrating to the ocean improved in wetter water years?
I believe that's, well, to surviving. Sorry, could you just restate it?
Yeah, is it correct to say that the results presented by Henderson show improved survival of out migrating smolt in wetter water years?
I believe that's generally the case. To be honest, I would need to remind myself of all the details on this paper. It's been a little time since I've looked at it.
Fair enough. Could we pull up Baykeeper 28? And Baykeeper 28 is a paper by Dr. Hasrick. So Dr. Hasrick, I think this is beyond the scope of what your testimony was presented, but if I or anybody else gets this wrong, feel free to weigh in and correct us here. Dr. Greenwood, are you familiar with Dr. Hasrick's paper that's Baykeeper Exhibit 28?
I'm generally familiar with it, yes.
Okay. And can we go to page 16 the PDF and look at figure 8A, which is the top right figure on the page. And the caption, Dr. Greenwood describes figure 8 as predicted survival per 10 kilometers per day as a function of mean annual flow, with intra-annual reach flow and the other covariates set to mean values. Do you agree that this shows increasing survival probability per 10 kilometers per day as flow increases?
Could you make it slightly smaller? I just would like to have a look at the caption. Thank you. Can you scroll up to A again, please? And can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Yeah, do you agree that the results presented in figure 8A show increasing likelihood of survival as flow increases?
They do.
Okay. And this is presented in cubic meters per second, not cubic feet per second. I will represent to you that 10,700 cubic feet per second is about 303 cubic meters per second. Does that sound about right?
Not let's see. Can you repeat that? I'm sorry. 10,700 CFS is about 3. I think that's approximately right.
Yeah, I've got Google's conversion calculator tells me 302.99. So
okay.
Just over 300.
Okay.
Do you agree that the results in this paper do not show the same sort of threshold change in survival probability that were presented by Michel's paper?
This paper didn't examine the evidence for threshold. I believe it only looked at linear type responses. Therefore, it only shows linear type responses.
Okay. Do you agree that at flows above 300 cubic meters per second, as represented on figure 8A, there are benefits to outmigrating Chinook salmon?
There is, as far as benefits, I wouldn't use the word benefit. I would say there is potentially higher survival per 10 kilometer day within the based on the relationship that we see, which has some spread around that predicted relationship.
Okay. Do you agree that the likelihood of survival increases or continues to increase even beyond the approximately 300 cubic meters per second?
It does. Well, the probability does increase above 303 cubic meters per second.
Okay.
Although there is, as a general trend, there is some spread around that line, as you can see by the gray on the plot.
Okay. And Dr. Greenwood, if you know, and Dr. Pastrick, if he doesn't, you feel free to weigh in again. This is about winter run Chinook salmon smolt, correct?
It's about winter run. Certainly, I'll defer to Dr. Hasrick as far as how the juveniles would be characterized.
Dr. Hasrick, if you will.
I believe the hatchery characterizes them as pre-smolts, but yes, they're generally larger than fry, so they would be either pre-smolt or smolts.
Okay. And the flows were measured that are represented here or reported on here were measured at Bend Bridge, correct?
Are you asking me or are you asking Marin?
I would need to review the methods. I'm sorry. I don't know offhand. I would have to confirm from the methods of the paper.
So Dr. Hasrick, I'll ask you if you remember.
Yes, Bend Bridge.
Okay, and that's well upstream of Wilkins Slough?
Yeah, and that was for the average annual flow.
Correct, thank you. Do you agree that the results that you found for winter run smolt or pre-smolt at Bend Bridge are different than the results from Michelle for fall run smolt at Wilkins Slough in terms of the impact of flows?
I'm not sure I understand that. I think that we're looking at an annual effect of flow on survival at a different location over a larger span of the river. Cyril's paper was specific to Wilkins Slough, so I'm not sure I can answer that directly.
Let me, I think you did, but let me just make sure I understand. You looked at the impact of flows on different fish and different locations than the Michelle paper did, correct?
That's correct.
And your results in terms of mean annual flows are different than the results that Michelle found at the one location that he was looking at for the threshold, correct?
I'm not sure. I mean, he was looking at a threshold analysis. I'm not sure that these are inconsistent with that. They're showing flows on a linear scale that are just over a larger part of the river. So I'm not sure that they're necessarily in contrast or conflict with his results.
Yeah, so I didn't mean to imply that they were contradictory. I just you have different information about the impacts of flow on one species of fish at different locations than Michelle does about the impacts of flow on a different species of fish.
You mean a different run of the same
Yes,
species?
correct. Yes.
Okay, yeah.
And then, and Dr. Hesrick, I'm happy to ask you this or Dr. Greenwood, but I want to look at figure 8C here as well. And I'm going to try and describe this, but please tell me if this is, if I butcher it. Figure 8C shows the survival probability on the y-axis. 5 different water years plotted across, right? Survival probability for 5 different water years plotted there. And then on the x-axis is the interannual deviation in flow for that specific water year. Is that right?
The interannual reach flow, yes.
Okay. And so on the x-axis where it says 0.0, that's like the mean flow for that water year. Is that correct?
Are you talking about the intercept? I don't see 0.0.
So on the x-axis of 8C, the third, it starts at -1 and goes to positive 2.5.
Right.
So what is 0?
Oh, I see it.
Do we need to, would it be helpful if we
Yeah.
zoomed in on the?
Yeah, so sorry. Yeah, these are standardized flow values with annual flow. So Yeah. What is your question again?
What does 0 represent? Or what does it mean when we go from 0 to 2.5, for example, on the x-axis?
So this is the combined effect of mean annual flow and interannual reach flow, as I said. And so what this is doing is accounting for the effect of mean annual flow in understanding what reach flow is. And so what this is showing here is that in really wet years, there's not a strong reach specific benefit to survival when flows are generally high. But in low flow years, right, during drought periods, there's a stronger reach specific benefit to survival in flow. Does that make sense?
So yeah, it does. So I think so. So let's look at a dry year then, right? Where there is a greater impact of interannual reach flow. Is that correct?
Yeah. So reach flow in dry years like 2013, changes in reach flow or at a smaller scale will have a larger impact on survival than when flows are generally higher at an annual scale, right? So in the really wet year of 2017, flows were universally high. Changes in flow at the reach scale are not going to influence survival as much.
And when you say changes in flow at the reach scale, is that like it's a dry year, but there was a huge storm in December and a huge storm in March that made, right, those flows, changed flows in those, narrow periods?
Right. So changes in flow at smaller time periods within a wet year, for instance. If there were only a few of those storms that occurred, they would have a greater impact on survival than if it was wet for the entire season.
Okay. So the way to understand the slope of the lines for the dry years in figure 8C is that during wet periods in drier years, those especially wet periods increase the survival probability for outmigrating salmon. Is that correct?
Yes, that seems correct.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Can we turn to Baykeeper 21, please? Thank you again, Dr. Pastrick, for helping out with your paper. I appreciate that. So Dr. Greenwood, exhibit Baykeeper 21 is a copy of a paper by Del Rosario et al. From 2013. Are you familiar with this paper?
I'm familiar with it.
And the title is Migration Patterns of Juvenile Winter Run-Sized Chinook Salmon through the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. And I want to start with the abstract, which is page 2 of the PDF. And on the second column, the right-hand column, well, at the bottom of the left-hand column, it indicates winter run salmon past Knight's Landing between October and April with substantial variation in peak time of entry that was strongly associated with the first high flows of the migration season, specifically the first day of flows of at least 400 cubic meters per second at Wilkins Slough coincided with the first day that was at least 5% of the total catch observed at Knight's Landing. Do you agree that Del Rosario's results show that flows at Wilkins Slough are needed to initiate out migration of winter run Chinook salmon of greater than 400 cubic meters per second?
I'm not sure that the study suggests that the flows are needed. It does show a correlation between flows, as it says, of at least 400 cubic meters per second with the first day that at least 5% of the annual total catch was observed.
Okay. Would a prohibition, would the proposed prohibition on diversions of flow at 10,000 CFS, well, I'm sorry. Would the proposed prohibition on diverting flows from going below 10,000 CFS at Wilkins Slough allow sites to divert flows that let me strike all of that and start over. I apologize. For the 400 CFS, and again, the Google converter says that's about 14,125 cubic feet per second. Do you believe that there's benefit for outmigrating winter run Chinook salmon in terms of increased survival at flows between 10,700 and 14,125 CFS?
Objection vague, and I believe the calculation was misstated in the beginning of 400 CFS.
Oh, I'm sorry. 400 CMS is 14,125 CFS.
CMS in case I think it was CFS. Yeah.
Mr. Busher, can you repeat the question, please? If you can.
Yeah. Can we go to page 11 of the PDF, please? Right there. If we could zoom in on the bottom, excuse me, the bottom left column. The sentence right after the citation to figure 4 says we observed substantial increases in cumulative catch of winter run at Knight's Landing, which corresponded to a flow threshold of 400 cubic meters per second at Wilkins Slough. Do you agree? Well, do you agree that flows between 10,700 CFS and 14,125 CFS at Wilkins Slough could be diverted under the current criteria for the sites project?
I believe that they could, assuming all other proposed criteria were met.
Okay, and if we move to the right column and up just a little bit, the paragraph there now in the middle starts the dates that Wilkins Slough flows. Do you see that, Dr. Greenwood?
I see it.
Okay, and that paragraph describes that the flows of 400 and 500 cubic meters per second are significantly correlated with outmigration, but not for a flow threshold of 300 cubic meters per second. Do you see that?
I see that.
Okay. And the 300 cubic meters per second, as we talked about earlier, is pretty close to the flow threshold that sites is using, correct?
I believe so.
Is it correct that based on the results of the Baykeeper 21, Del Rosario's paper, diverting flows between 300 and 400 cubic meters per second at Wilkins Slough would have negative effects on winter run Chinook salmon migration survival?
I'm sorry, did you say based on this paper?
Yes.
Not necessarily.
Why not?
It would really depend on, well, it would depend on what this is. This is describing occurrence of winter run in rotary screw traps. There's no element of survival necessarily associated with this. I believe your question was, would it increase survival or decrease survival? This is really just looking at the occurrence in rotary screw traps of juveniles.
Is it true that a higher occurrence of those juveniles in those traps is generally indicative of a higher abundance of outmigrating fish at those locations?
Generally indicative, perhaps.
Okay. And generally, more outmigrating fish, especially endangered fish, is better for the survival of that species, correct?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Generally, more outmigrating winter run Chinook salmon is better for the survival of Chinook salmon.
Generally speaking.
Okay. And diverting flows below 400 cubic meters per second, about 14,125 CFS, would reduce the success of that outmigration, correct?
I'm not sure that that's the case.
Okay.
There could be potential for negative effects, but
And can we turn to page 13 of the PDF, figure 5? Zoom out just a little bit. Thank you very much, Ms. Mullen, for your help. So figure 5 in Del Rosario's paper shows as a red line across each of these graphs what the authors describe as a flow threshold of 400 cubic meters per second. And as they say in the, if we could scroll down so we could see the caption as well, as they say in the caption, that flow triggers abrupt and substantial winter run migration into the Delta at Knight's Landing. Do you agree that the flows above 10,007 or above 300 cubic meters per second are showing substantial winter run migration? I'm sorry, let me start over. Do you agree that the flows above 400 cubic meters per second are showing substantial winter run migration or triggering substantial winter run migration?
there was a statistically significant correlation between the catch of winter on Chinook salmon juveniles in the rotary screw trap at Knight's Landing when examined in relation to the 400 cubic meters per second value. They examined 300. They also examined 500, as we saw on the prior page. So those are fairly broad chunks, I suppose, in terms of 300, 400, 500. They didn't examine explicitly values in between those values.
But they found 300 to not have this same correlative effect, correct?
I believe they did not find a statistically significant correlation for 300 cubic meters per second.
Thank you. And then one last note from this paper, if we could go to page 8 of the PDF. On the right side, in the top third of the paragraph that starts apparent residence time, Dr. Greenwood, Del Rosario finds that the mean residence time for the study was 87 days. Do you generally agree with that conclusion in terms of the time that out-migrating salmon spend?
Are you referring specifically to winter run? Because this is what they were assessing in this paper, winter run sized fish. I'm aware of other papers that are looking at residence time in the Delta that have lower residence time than this, that have attempted to look at the actual not simply length at date, but also based on the other factors. I'm thinking of otolith biochemistry, for example. That would be the ear bones that have suggested shorter residence time than this. So what we see on the screen is referring specifically within the parameters discussed in this paper, winter on Chinook salmon sized juveniles.
And given that we can talk about specifically, right, the fish analyzed in this paper, is it accurate to say that the conclusion of this paper is that once there is a sufficient storm or flow event to trigger out-migration, it's going to take 2 or 3 months for those juveniles to complete their journey down the river system and into the Delta, correct?
This paper specifically looked at the apparent residence time between the main capture at Knight's Landing in rotary screw traps versus the main capture at Chips Island as kind of being understood as residence time. So can you repeat your question? Sorry, I may have got lost along the way.
No, thank you. I think that clarifies part of my question. So these out-migrating juveniles are somewhere, right, well upstream of those locations when they start their migration, correct?
They are, I'm sorry, upstream of both Knight's Landing and Chips Island, or?
Yes. Yes.
Yes, they would be.
And then there's a triggering event under the paper of 400 cubic meters per second or more. Those fish begin to migrate downstream, and then they spend a mean of 87 days under this analysis in the Delta, essentially, after they've made it all the way through the Sacramento River, correct?
The paper's firstly talking about median residence there that we see on the screen of 87 days. as far as how long they spend in the delta, there's no individual fish that's examined for when it arrives at a particular place to when it leaves. The paper makes inferences based on when the catches are increasing at Knight's Landing, rotary screw trap, and then when the catches are increasing at Chips Island. And with each of those, there's a selection of a particular, I believe, a particular date of the 50th percentile, for example. I'd have to look back at the paper to recall the details on it, but so it's inferring from capture at different locations what the residence time may be of these winter on Chinook salmon sized individuals.
Based on this paper, right? I hear those caveats. This assumes that there is some amount of travel time from where they start the outmigration to Knight's Landing, and then an additional 87 days mean residence time in the Delta before they cross Chips Island. Is that generally correct?
Sorry, can you repeat it?
Is it generally correct that for the fish analyzed in this paper, Del Rosario 2013, it is those fish migrate down the Sacramento River, reach Knight's Landing, and then spend a mean of 87 days in the Delta before they pass Chips Island? Is that generally correct?
Well, median, speaking to median rather than mean.
I'm sorry.
But
correct.
again, it's the inference from in the paper is based on the captures at the two locations as far as the time spent within the delta.
Let me try this way. Can you estimate for me how long from when those eggs hatch to when the fish reach the estuary, those that have managed to successfully make that migration for winter run Chinook salmon?
From when they hatch successfully as eggs to to the ocean?
The bay, the ocean, whatever you can tell me.
I'd have to look back at details. I think it's variable depending on, it may vary depending on different hydrological conditions and things like that. Generally speaking, for winter on, they would be hatching, I think, in kind of well, I'd really have to look it up. But I think generally speaking, kind of hatching in the late summer, perhaps, and then ultimately leaving, perhaps around about the late winter, early spring.
Okay. And during the entire time that they are migrating down the river or in the delta, they are potentially impacted by the flows in the river and into the delta, correct?
The entire time? Sorry, that was me asking a question. You were saying during the entire time they're impacted.
The entire time yeah. So let me try again. Right, from the time that those eggs are laid, right, all the way through the time whatever proportion of them successfully reach the bay or the ocean, right? For the entire time that they're in those rivers and in the delta, they are potentially impacted by the flow in those rivers, correct?
Well, they're potentially, the flow to some extent is going to influence the conditions that they experience in the river. As long as they're in the river, there may be an influence of flow.
And that's true once they're in the delta as well, right? There needs to be sufficient delta inflow to make sure they don't get, entrained or lost in those waterways, correct?
I'm not sure how you're defining sufficient in that case. There's differences. What were the outcomes that you mentioned? Entrainment or loss?
Let me pause here. We got to the point where flows would impact them while they're in the river, right? I just want to know that that same thing is true. The flow in the river that into the delta and out of the delta potentially impacts the salmon while they're in the delta, correct?
There are correlations with aspects of their, for example, survival within parts of the delta. Entering the delta, or rather, I should say, especially at the transition, the transition between more riverine conditions and more tidal conditions, there are correlations between riverine inflow, and I'm talking here about the North Delta, Sacramento River inflow in particular. There are correlations there, but moving downstream as we get into a more tidal environment, the influence of inflow is less. So it depends where you are in the delta, I think.
Okay, thank you. Could we can take this one down and pull up Baykeeper Exhibit 27, please. This is a paper by Hance et al. 2022, I believe. Are you familiar with this paper, Dr. Greenwood?
I'm familiar with it.
Okay. Can we go to, and Ms. Mullen, my PDF is paginated the way the journal is, so it's page 420 of 19. That work? Yes, perfect. Figure 5. So, Dr. Greenwood, figure 5 shows a series of graphs of survival probability on the y-axis, and then flow in cubic meters per second on the x-axis, and plots out the survival probability based on certain flow levels for specific reaches of the Delta or the Sacramento River. Do you understand that?
I do understand.
Okay. And if we look at figure 6 or figure 5, chart 6A, Freeport to Butter, I think Steamboat. Do you see that?
I do.
Do you have an estimate for the well, do you agree that flows of approximately 1,000 cubic meters per second are necessary to maximize survival in that reach of the delta?
Vague. Objection vague as to maximize survival.
I think you, Mr. Busher, can you just clarify what you mean? I think you can.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks.
It'll be a little bit easier. So those lines in these figures, Dr. Greenwood, show the estimated survival rate and then the error bars or confidence interval that we discussed earlier, correct?
They do.
Okay, and so if we look at, for example, let's start with figure 05A, the second row far left. Can you estimate for me where the survival rate approaches 1? And if we need to zoom in, I'm happy to.
Yeah, if we could zoom in a bit. How are you defining approaches?
Well, I mean, can't cross one. I don't assume it's very often actually 100%. But where do you think that that approaches, right? The survival approaches 100% for that reach?
I don't know, I might need it zoomed in even more, but depending how you're looking at it, you might say 2000 on the x-axis, on the horizontal axis. You might say 1000.
Okay, fair enough. So somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 cubic meters per second is when we are starting to approach 100% survival in that reach, correct?
Perhaps.
Do you disagree with the way I described it?
Again, it depends how you're meaning approaching 100%.
Okay.
It's closer at 1000 on the horizontal axis than it is at whatever let's say 500.
Substantially so, correct?
It means higher. I'm not sure what substantially is meaning, but
okay. And the same for figure 06A or chart 06A in this figure. Right? Somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 is where we're approaching one, and higher at 1,000 than at 500, correct?
That's what I see.
Okay. And those two, 5A and 6A, show flows into Freeport and then out of Freeport, correct?
You mean the horizontal axis is referring to Freeport, flow at Freeport?
Yeah, and I'm happy to go back and look at the map that's in the paper if that's helpful to you.
I would have to check actually on it might even be in the caption of this figure, I'm not sure.
Okay. So go ahead.
Freeport flow.
Yeah.
So yeah, Freeport flow.
Okay. And if we could go back to page 412 of the PDF. And this is a map of the Sacramento River, San Joaquin Delta, showing the locations of the acoustic telemetry and the reaches that are identified here. And if we could just zoom out, this paper is specific to the area from Knight's Landing through Chips Island, correct?
Sorry, can you repeat your question?
Yeah, if we look at this map here in terms of what was, studied, this studies the impact of flows on juvenile salmon from Knight's Landing through Chips Island, correct?
I believe that's right, although I do notice the additional reach downstream of Chips Island that I would probably need to verify what that's meaning in terms of the methods.
Fair enough, thank you. And I appreciate the clarification. I just want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. When we're looking at the percent survival, right, by these reaches, right, an outmigrating juvenile has to be able to survive each of these reaches to successfully make it to the bay and the ocean, correct?
It would each. Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry. I mean, I think it's pathway specific, if you will. So a given juvenile, a given juvenile may take different pathways through the delta.
But we're then multiplying together the percent survival from all of the different reaches of that pathway in order to figure out what the chances that the juvenile makes it from Knight's Landing to the ocean, correct? Or to the bay?
Generally, yes.
Okay. We can take this one down. I'm happy to keep going. I'm happy to take a break. We're at our almost approaching lunch hour.
Our normal lunch hour. I think that makes sense, Mr. Busher. What I propose is that we return at 1 o'clock, but before we break, is there anything else we need to address before we break for lunch? All right. Remember to give time to log back into the Zoom, and we will take our lunch break and return at 1 p.m. Thank you.